right, good morning or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm William Choong. I'm the managing editor of Fulcrum, the commentary website of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. And today I have an illustrious panel with me. We want to talk about the State of Southeast Asia survey and, of course, the impact of the Ukraine-Russia issue on Southeast Asia. And with me, I have Elina, Noor from the Asia Society Policy Institute. I have Huong from the uh, ASPI from Canberra, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And I have my colleague Sharon Seah, who is the coordinator of the ASEAN Study Center here at the ISEAS Yusof Institute. And of course, as you know, the State of Southeast Asia survey, which is widely followed in Southeast Asia and around the world, was launched on the 16th of February. And we've seen a really good reception to the survey. And 8 days later, on the 24th of February, we saw Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or what Moscow calls a special military operation. And we've seen very varied responses from ASEAN member states to the invasion. Of course, Singapore came out with a very strong reaction, followed by Brunei, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So in this podcast, we want to go through some of the highlights of the survey, or at least in the eyes of our speakers. And also, we want to discuss what are some of the implications that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has for ASEAN in terms of some of the policy choices that Southeast Asian countries will be making. So let's go straight into the survey. I'm sure Elina and Huong, you have read the survey from cover to cover. Maybe I want to start with Elina as to what do you think are some of the most striking bits of the report that caught your attention? Elina?
Yeah, thanks, William. I think by and large, many of the findings of the report were not wholly surprising to me. And I know this was a massive undertaking. So congratulations to Sharon and team for putting out yet another excellent survey. But I think two things from this year's survey really stood out to me. And the first was the vote of confidence amongst the respondents for their government's response to COVID. And perhaps that was the cynical part of me, but I was expecting a slightly lower vote of confidence for whatever reason, probably my bias. And then the second thing that stood out to me was the slightly more than half of respondents who voted positively for the Quad, actually. So those were really two of the findings that were quite significant, I felt, from my perspective.
And of course, COVID and the kind of vote of confidence in the Quad, Elina, is kind of, they are related, right? Because the way that they voted for the Quad was kind of related to the way that the question was phrased, because the question was phrased, what are your feelings towards the Quad in the light of the Quad, having all these deliverables, right? And one of them is on vaccinations, and I think what's the second one? Was it climate change? So in a sense, they are related, and that's probably something about the Quad that has made it a bit more palatable to the region.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in here. We did ask a question of the Quad 2 years ago, and it was a very straight cut question, what do you think of the Quad? And the responses were not as positive as now. And this year, we rephrased the question because we noted that the narrative of the Quad has actually changed from a pure security pact to now looking at more practical cooperation aspects, which is why the question had to be phrased as, the strengthening of the Quad, prospects of tangible cooperation in these areas. Do you feel it's positive and reassuring? And so that's how it came about. I like to believe that it was because the Quad has been listening to what ASEAN wants, and that that they've actually been shifting their narrative a little to accommodate these interests.
And also because they don't have any other choice but to go down the route that ASEAN has kind of mapped out in, we need deliverables, you need to show us the goods to get some traction in the region. And so, yes, I think they have been listening as well. Thanks for that. And Huong, do you have any kind of thoughts about the survey in terms of highlights?
Thanks, William. Yes, I think it was quite an important survey of the regional views in a very volatile time, because when the survey was put out, I think it was very still at the midst of pandemic. A lot of things were moving. Not yet the conflict in Ukraine, but a lot of other things. So it was interesting to see, for example, whether the regional views on the vaccine diplomacy really shifted. And it was interesting to see that there are slight changes in the perception of trust to major powers, not overly changing, but there are slight changes compared to the previous years. So, for example, there's a little bit more confidence in China than in the previous year. But I would say that probably the vaccine diplomacy have not yielded like overwhelming changing ground that one would expect. There are, of course, different preferences to the vaccine brands and whatnot, but I don't think that alone has shifted regional views on the great powers and their role in the region. And another point that was interesting to see was, of course, the responses and the reactions to the Myanmar crisis and how ASEAN as a region responded. The survey really reflects what we see as a diplomatic impasse, I would say, because about a third would support, a little bit more than a third, but about a third would say neutral or close to the third, and about a third was not satisfied. So you clearly see the division among the respondent that really is reflected in the diplomatic impasse in the meetings and efforts that are being shown in practice. So we see how the region is divided on multiple issues, and Myanmar being one of key of them.
In terms of just the China-US dynamic, Huong, do you think that, China has pretty much retained kind of its top dog ranking in terms of economic influence as well as political strategic influence. But I think there was an interesting development in terms of the US kind of trending up in terms of, how respondents view, confidence in the United States, on international law, and regional order. So do you think that that's kind of like moving from Trump to Biden effect? There's kind of a bounce there, or how do you see it?
Yeah, I do see a little bit slight more confidence in the US, even though I think there is also some adjustment in terms of expectations. I think the previous year showed much more enthusiasm about incoming Biden administration and what that would mean for US engagement to Southeast Asia. I think this year it did show slight decrease in that confidence in the engagement itself, right? But there are more confidence in other areas. You mentioned some of them, William, and I was surprised to see that there's more confidence in US as leading in trade agenda, even though we didn't see much of that changing, but for some reasons, I think there's most confidence in US as a leader in trade agenda among the respondents this year around. So I think there's a mixed picture. There are slight fluctuations, not massive fluctuation, but there's adjustment towards how much US will engage with the region. But there are a little bit more confidence in other areas, including in the frequent question that the survey asked: if you have to choose between US and China, more would choose US and similar like last year, but slightly more this year as well.
I think what I was trying to say, Huong, was that if you look at the indicators, at least on the Quad and AUKUS, it tends to be trending up. Of course, we've discussed the Quad. AUKUS, I think it was something like 36% that was kind of positive of AUKUS, and I think that's quite encouraging. Although we have to kind of caveat by saying that, the other categories were a bit more guarded. I mean, something that it will spark an arms race, something that it will weaken ASEAN centrality. And of course, on that confidence in kind of the US being a leader in trade, that I agree with you. That came out like an anomaly to Sharon and I, and we're trying to imagine what was going on in the heads of the respondents when they voted the way that they voted. Maybe Sharon, you want to jump in here and give some of your thoughts?
Honestly, I don't have a clear-cut answer to that. It bogged me as well because there were no concrete actions we've seen in Southeast Asia, at least in the past year since President Joe Biden took up office. We did hear of an expected Indo-Pacific strategy that will come out, but in any case, the strategy paper came out, I believe, just a few days before our survey launched. And even then, we have no details on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We have so little to work on. So I think it is just this pent-up anticipation that the US would come back and engage in a big way economically in the minds of the survey takers. Whether it will actually pan out or turn out, it remains to be seen. Yeah, and maybe for Elina, you're sitting in DC, you might have something to share with us or to add on to what I've just said.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll have your work cut out for you next year, Sharon, because the survey results seem to have shown kind of a buoyant bubble of inflationary optimism, maybe, to be a little wordy. But I think it'll be interesting to see if that optimism was premature upon reflection. As you rightly pointed out, there haven't been very many details released about IPEF. And I think there has so far been a bit of disappointment in what may or may not be left out. I'm talking about market access. So how IPEF passes out, when it will be released, on top of the fact that the summit now seems to have been postponed, will probably, if I were a betting person, will probably change the results of this optimistic view of the US if we're looking at things a year from now.
I want to jump in here, Elina. I think what you said was quite apt, and what you say about IPEF passing out. I think when you say passing out, you mean it being released publicly, but not passing out as in passing out. But in a sense, you're not wrong to say passing out, because we've had some discussions with American officials and diplomats, and they keep telling us, for listeners who are not familiar with the term, we're talking about Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that is outlined in the Indo-Pacific Strategy document that was released by Washington earlier in February. And so we've been talking to all these American officials, and they keep telling us that it's coming out, we're going to have that strategy. But I think Sharon would agree with me that there's kind of, like you say, there's an inflated, buoyant bubble here, and there's a lot of expectations about the economic framework. But in the end, the apple won't fall far from the tree as to what was already listed in the Indo-Pacific Strategy document. It's going to be about supply chains, it's going to be about digital economy, it's going to be kind of what you call higher level kind of economic initiatives. But in terms of the meat and potatoes, in terms of market access that countries like Malaysia wants, countries like Indonesia wants, countries like the Philippines want, we're not going to see that for a long time coming until they can convince Joe Blow in Texas or Mississippi or Kansas to think twice about the US joining these mega trade deals. Sharon, do you have any thoughts?
Which is why when the Indo-Pacific strategic paper came out, it was quite clear that they were also addressing the domestic audience with this prong of, co-prosperity with the Indo-Pacific region. And I believe that was in part talking to your Joe Blows in Michigan and wherever else to try to get that domestic buy-in. But the details, like you said, I think if you're imagining a regional trade agreement sort of thing, like equivalent to the TPP, that's not going to happen. They've been, well, from the White House press briefings, it's also been coming out that it's quite clear market access is off the table. So a lot of it has got to do with now managing the expectations so that when that buoyant inflationary optimistic bubble bursts, it doesn't impact every one of us too badly. Yeah.
Yeah, and don't forget that congressional elections are happening this November. So your point about speaking to the domestic audience is a really important one.
Huong, do you have any thoughts on that? How does it look to you from Australia, from Canberra?
Yeah, I was going back to your point of Quad and where, US and partners and allies can make some difference in the region, or how can it engage despite, of course, the domestic considerations that we've been discussing. And the point on the Quad that this year's survey showed was quite positive, as you mentioned. Nearly 60% supported. But the question was very specific, right? It was about tangible areas of cooperation, which is vaccine diplomacy and climate change. So it's very specific. In that regard, I mean, most of the region would welcome US partnership with other allies and partners, whether it's Quad or other arrangement, would very much welcome, tangible areas of cooperation. But if you put, more generally about the Quad or Quad arrangement institutions, it tends to be still conflated with, other ambitions that Quad may have because of its name, security dialogue in its name. Yeah. But if you put a very tangible areas of cooperation where clearly Southeast Asia benefit from, and there's a demand for both vaccines or climate actions, then obviously it is an example of where such partnership can be well perceived.
Perhaps there's a case for the Quad to drop the word security from quadrilateral security dialogue, and just turn it into a quadrilateral dialogue. That might sell better in the region. That's a suggestion. Conversely, given that we're talking about a Quad and we're talking about economic frameworks, it seems that China seems to have gained a bit of traction, right? In the past year, we've seen RCEP, and of course China is being very clear that it wants to join CPTPP, and in a sense we've come full circle. If any of you can remember, it was Barack Obama, I think was it in 2012, who says, we are jumping into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the United States is the country that will decide who will make the rules when it comes to future trade agreements. And that's sounding like so last century now, right? Because we've seen the US withdrawing from the TPP in 2017, and now we are seeing China wanting to join, TPP version 2.0. So how do you see that? Because if the Quad likes to talk about regional order and kind of security and freedom of navigation, but it's China who actually dishes out the goods when it comes to market access. And of course we don't need to go into the point that China is a top trading partner and investor in Southeast Asia as well. So do you think that come survey 2023 survey that China will even gain more points on that front? Elina?
Yeah, you're right, William. It's so BC, right? So before COVID. We had gone back a few years ago and asked US trade negotiators in particular, right? Cast your mind forward to a few years. Can you imagine like China asking to join the CPTPP based on rules that the US essentially had written and sought to drive, push through in the region. Who would have thought? But we never expected a pandemic, so I guess all things are off the not on off the table, I suppose. But I think if we again cast our mind maybe a year forward, I don't know that anybody seriously expects China to be able to live up to the CPTPP rules of the road as they are right now. But the fact that China did express interest in joining, I think, signifies quite a bit, and certainly is symbolic in its own way. And as we all know, symbols go a long way in this region. But I guess we'll see, right? Whether that translates into anything. To me, what is striking is that the US often castigates Southeast Asia for picking the US for security purposes and China for its economic prosperity. But that is the reality because, as you pointed out, William, China has been able to dish out the economic goods, and the US has, fortunately or unfortunately, been able to provide the security guarantees, but only just that for now. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Absolutely right. Huong, I think when it comes to China and the CPTPP, I think we will have to kind of look at how countries like Australia and Japan actually see, China's application, right? Because, it was Japan who was kind of the midwife that, brought about the CPTPP. Of course, we have some Australian colleagues who would dispute that and say that, well, Australia played a big role, in the midwifery, moving from TPP to CPTPP. But how do you see it in Australia? How would Australia view kind of China's application to join CPTPP, given the state of the rather rosy or less than rosy relations between Canberra and Beijing at the moment?
Yeah, I think at the current stage with the current government, everything China does is a no from Canberra. And I think the elections are coming up in May, but I don't think there is going to be a massive, at least we don't see it coming, a massive turn or change in the China policy. Generally, Australia would not want to welcome China in CPTPP, but also I think there's a bigger question, whether it is a viable option to block someone else from participating. But there is a question whether can China join, but can also Taiwan join, right? At the same time, the UK has already applied, and I think there's a saying, I forgot from which country, but it says that you can't make a point if you're not present at the table. So for US not being at the CPTPP, we can't have a conversation about setting rules and norms or having a decision power there either. Now the question is how other powers, like you mentioned, will interact and will set new norms. Like we are in the business of norm setting right now, as that all rules and norms are not being rigorously respected in the current world order, aren't we? But I think in general, Southeast Asian countries, those that are part of CPTPP won't in principle exclude anyone just because. So I think there's conversation to be had whether if China participates, does that also opens door for countries like or economies like Taiwan itself? That should be a more of equal footing consideration, right?
I agree, except that I wouldn't in the life of me think how Beijing would think about Taiwan being admitted into CPTPP. That's certainly a no-go zone, right, for Beijing. But I agree with you. I think if I were a cynical policymaker in Washington, I would say that I'll get my allies in Japan and Australia to kind of put procedural obstacles in China's way as to, you have to jump through 10 hoops before you can even think about furthering your application for CPTPP. Perhaps we can move to kind of the topic of the day, of the month, if not the decade, which is Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine. I just want to get your first cut reactions. Perhaps Elina can lead us off as to what bearing or what implications do you think what's happening in Ukraine has for Southeast Asia writ large?
So the implications and potential impact have already been quite well documented. But personally, I am still a little confused as to what to believe and who to believe. There's so much unraveling to do because things are still evolving. And there are so many dimensions to this conflict that we haven't begun to consider. Everything just seems to be moving at rapid fire pace, which is probably what the Russians had in mind when they invaded Ukraine, but it doesn't seem that their military campaign has moved at an equal rapid fire pace. And so we're likely to see this drag out for a while. But in the meantime, a whole bunch of people seem to have made up their minds very determinedly about where to stand and what position to take. And I just feel, and I'm probably in the minority on this, that it's far too early to be taking a position, any other position, apart from the fact that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is illegal and contravenes international law. But there's so much background that needs to be unpacked, I feel.
Would you think that there will be, in terms of analysts in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, do you think that there will be a transmission channel as to what's happening in Ukraine and how, there could be some transmission of, implications or impacts via China, given that there's a kind of an axis between China and Russia, and perhaps they might somehow impact this region? I think Taiwan has been mentioned in this aspect. Maybe Huong can give us some insight onto that.
I think the invasion of Russia into Ukraine puts everybody at a really anxious position and unease, especially smaller and middle-sized countries that felt protected by the international system, international law, and the self-restraint of the big guys who will behave themselves and won't invade just because they are bigger and they can. So I think that's that confidence in the international system has been shaken for sure, and certainly I wouldn't go into conclusion that this can be copy-paste in other instances, such as you mentioned, Taiwan or even South China Sea. But certainly there is this anxiety, palatable anxiety that is no longer in the realm of discussion or debate. That big and powerful countries, if they decide so, they would go to the extent of invading, which Putin showed. The question is, how international system and international community reacts, because diplomacy is the way to support international law, which Elina just mentioned as well. So I think there is a role for everyone, even though Southeast Asian countries traditionally and for all good reasons prefer kind of a neutral stance and not taking a side and not being dragged into conflicts. And some to even go to the extent of saying that it's a faraway conflict that don't affect them directly. But I think it's even in the oil and gas and food prices and international flight and freight, it is affecting everyone, let alone the humanitarian crisis happening there. And there is this notion of anxiety that peace dividend era is gone. What next then? Can Southeast Asian countries as middle-sized the small countries support that what remain of the international system and not allow such occurrence happen again? I think this year is quite critical because you have Indonesia as a chair of G20.
Yeah.
You have Thailand as a chair of APEC.
Yeah.
You have Cambodia chair of ASEAN and East Asia Summit. So really in the leadership role beyond just the direct Southeast Asia region, but really exercising that leadership and agency in the broader multilateral fora. So there will be pressure on the Southeast Asia to have a say, especially that we want to claim an ASEAN agency, but when there's a pressure to act and lead, then there is a hesitancy there. So I think it's a really critical year for Southeast Asia, and the conflict in Ukraine is not a far away and unrelated conflict to the region.
2 points that I'd like to pick out. China has went on to say that Taiwan is not Ukraine. And I think Beijing has a point there because, it's unthinkable that in the 21st century that, Ukraine will be invaded, and we'll see war again on the European continent. But the fact remains that, Taiwan is not Ukraine, as in Taiwan is not an independent sovereign country. And I can't even begin to remember how many countries actually have a one China policy, in the sense that, in effect, Taiwan is not independent or sovereign. So I think when you mention reactions, I think, let's say in some point in the future, if there is a kind of amphibious invasion of Taiwan by China, I doubt that you'll see the same voting patterns in the United Nations General Assembly, right? Simply because, we are comparing apples and oranges here. And of course, I'm sure a lot of countries will be calling for de-escalation and kind of talks and dialogue and mediation and all that, but we can't avoid the fact that Ukraine is not the same category as Taiwan. And Huong, when you mention about ASEAN countries exercising agency, I think one of the most pertinent signposts that we can watch out for this year is, of course, like you said, Thailand on APEC and India on the G20. Is like, basically, will Putin show up? And if he does show up, what happens? I mean, that's like kind of the question of the day, right? Like, if Putin decides to show up, will the other countries boycott? And which I think is quite likely. If Putin does find a time to actually visit, Bangkok, Sharon, do you have any thoughts on the issue?
I think here in Southeast Asia, we've been very busy explaining or trying to articulate the implications of the Russian invasion on Ukraine to this group of states that actually have been only very recently decolonized. 50 plus years is not a long time in history, and some of these memories are still quite fresh for some of them. For instance, in our own backyard, Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia and so on. I think that's still very much in memory of people living in that part of the world. So it was
Vietnam
quite
would
surprising.
say that would be, sorry to interrupt, Vietnam would say that was responsibility to protect.
That's right, yeah. So there are different versions and different interpretations. No one can say anyone's completely right or wrong. But in any case, it was quite surprising to see how ASEAN reacted to the invasion, and they took a while to kind of come down and consolidate their thoughts. But what I wanted to say is that also the crisis has domestic implications. And I think that's not very much talked about because there seems to be a polarization in society. Here in Singapore, we have been seeing a lot more of that coming out on social media, where people are saying that Singapore, as a small country, you should just hide and not say anything, just oh, I've been muted somehow. And then there's as I was saying, there's a polarization in society. In Indonesia as well, I've heard that there's been different views coming across the spectrum about Ukraine and Russia, and similarly in Singapore as well. And that conversation has been taking place ever since the Ukrainian crisis happened, and largely because people feel that there are segments in society that's taking the Chinese view that Russia is not at fault, the US is at fault, the West is at fault. And all that's very confusing. So a lot of that unraveling has to happen like Elina says, we've got to also think about where we stand in society, and that's not being talked about at the moment. So I think the implications not only go across globally, regionally, but also domestically in each of our own countries. Yeah.
And of course, there'll be a lot of unhappiness on the ground. The direct impacts, the inflationary impacts of oil and gas price increases, and how that impacts the domestic inflation as well. I'm going to move to kind of what I call a potentially controversial topic, and you can see the question that Sharon has prepared. The topic about China's Vice Foreign Minister Le Yucheng talking about Indo-Pacific strategy being akin to NATO's eastward expansion, and basically to quote what he said at a recent forum, the Indo-Pacific strategy is as dangerous as the NATO strategy of eastward expansion in Europe. If allowed to go unchecked, it would bring unimaginable consequences and ultimately push the Asia-Pacific into a fiery pit. It seems like he's being quite poetic here. So what are your views? I tend to disagree. You can't compare the two together. At the very least, Indo-Pacific strategy is not an alliance. It's just a vision of regional order. But perhaps, Elina, you might want to jump in and agree or disagree with our Chinese minister friend.
Yeah, I think there's a fair bit of exaggeration here, and I would agree that it's not an apt comparison, with all due respect. To be honest, I think many commentators in ASEAN would say, what's new about the Indo-Pacific strategy, and
exactly.
There was more hope for greater departure from what was already on the table with the Americans. And so the Indo-Pacific strategy seems a bit tame. So I mean, in short, I think the quotation is really a bit far-fetched.
It's so easy, right, to draw these very simplistic parallels because it appeals. It's something that's easy to digest. You think about, the US Indo-Pacific strategy and drawing a parallel to the NATO. So I think that kind of appeals to a certain segment, as I mentioned earlier.
It's a pungent soundbite, I'll say. It's kind of pungent. It captures your attention, but when you drill it down, I would tend to disagree. It's not the same category. Huong, would you have some thoughts on the quote?
Yeah, I also think it is, the way the Chinese diplomats like to describe things, and they, for example, referred previously to Quad as the ocean foam that will disappear. So, again, I'm quite poetic, isn't it? But I think, from the point of view of China, maybe it is, and in a way, they might feel targeted by the strategy, but not for the rest of the region, because what is in the Pacific strategy? It's still there are a lot of things to be clarified in this different concept, policies, strategies, even outlook. It's not a strategy. It's certainly not building new forms of alliances. The countries leading the Indo-Pacific strategy can't afford that. They keep saying that everybody have to shoulder their own security, so there's no appetite of building NATO-like structure for sure. The Indo-Pacific strategy is about the free and open and prosperous and secure region. So, for the rest of the region, I don't think that is that threatening. It's actually the opposite. If we quote the previous example we discussed about Quad and the vaccine partnership, our climate action, are those a part of Indo-Pacific strategy? Yes, they are. So what is threatening? Indeed, not much. I think it's quite contributing to the region. But I think what the Chinese diplomats or strategic thinkers think of the Indo-Pacific strategy, they think about attempts to sort of contain or keep China's expansion at bay, or at least signal to China that any ambitions of expansion and further coercion will have some response. So that's what they are referring to. But I think for the rest of the region, at times it actually comes handy because a lot of countries in the region experience that coercion coming from China. So to have some others, bigger guys coming up and saying that this is not going to be accepted, is actually to their benefit, isn't it?
I would agree. I think that the Indo-Pacific strategy is kind of a strategy looking for a tangible manifestation. It's not an alliance. It's not even a pseudo kind of alliance. It's just a strategy, and it's not gotten a lot of buy-in from ASEAN because ASEAN came out with its own version of Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think I agree with you, Huong. Is the Chinese are probably overplaying it, but I would say, to be kinder to China, that Chinese strategy and kind of Indo-Pacific strategy has cancelled themselves out, in the sense that the Indo-Pacific strategy is not getting a lot of uptake, but China continues doing what it does, Belt and Road Initiative and kind of economic initiatives with the rest of the region. Sharon wants to jump in here.
Yeah, just want to pick up on the point about the US as a security partner. And I think what's happened in Ukraine has also brought home to countries in this region the point that the security umbrella the US has provided is actually shrinking, and that everyone's gotta be on your own. You gotta look out for yourself and your own security. And when I look at bringing it back to the survey, at this question of whether the US is a reliable strategic partner, the rankings that express confidence that the US is indeed a good partner has actually shrunk, and it's shrunk quite dramatically. So I think that sensing that, what's coming out from DC saying that, there's no appetite for this and so on, it's kind of trickling down as well, and it's shown up in the survey. So it'll be very interesting to look at the results next year to see if it's shrunk even further.
Thanks for that, Sharon. I think pretty well dovetails with what our discussion about Indo-Pacific strategy and perceptions of the US as a reliable strategic partner. Well, it looks like we have covered a lot of ground today on the survey, and Russia and Ukraine and China's piety poetry. So I want to thank our participants again in this podcast for your time, for Huong, for Elina, for Sharon, for spending the time with us, and especially for Elina, who's probably going past or your bedtime, wherever you are. Here's wishing you a great weekend, and we hope to see you again and talk again. Thanks again.